I am Raymond R. Brown, and now that I'm nearing 65 years of age, I thought it about time that I should tape and write some of my story for the last 60 years, starting with my first memory of anything, starting at the age of 5 years. First, I will mention my grandfather, who I only remember seeing once in my lifetime, with his big white mustache with icicles hanging on both ends of his whiskers, feeling his way down 3 big stone steps leading down to the side yard in about a foot of snow. I was told by my uncle that he was a great cabinet maker and a wonderful carpenter, and he was always in demand to do fine woodwork in rich people's homes in Georgetown. He would work hard for about a month, then knock off about a month, and stay drunk off of beer. He was a very kind man, and was a good husband, and had 11 children born in a small frame house at 3416 T Street, which is now Reservoir Road, in the same house I was born in, October 16, 1904. My uncle, who I visit in Pompano Beach, told me recently that my grandfather only paid $15 a month rent at the home that I was speaking of, and it was owned by one of the first horse-drawn streetcar conductors in the city of Washington, and he offered the house for sale to Grandma for $1,750. The same house sold in 1960 for close to $40,000, and is probably now worth $60,000 or $65,000 at this date. My grandmother was a wonderful character, and right up to the time she became quite ill and then died, she always loved to ride in automobiles. All you had to do was just call her, and she'd be ready in 5 minutes to take a ride around Haynes Point or wherever you offered to drive her. Like I said, I knew very little of my grandfather, but Grandma had a good life. I remembered once when she was visiting my cousin, Dick Chappell, she took the wrong door. Instead of going into the coat closet or the bathroom, she opened the door to the basement and fell head first all the way down the steps, and had a few broken bones and a very bad cut head. But the bad tragedy in her life was when she was younger, and she shook out a waist after it had been laundered, or maybe before it had been laundered, and a sharp, pearl-headed pin stuck right in her eye pupil. And maybe if it had been modern times, the eye could have been saved, but she lost the sight of that eye the rest of her life. I'd like to mention one of the most unforgettable and most lovable characters. She was Grandma's washwoman or cleaning woman for 45 years, and after Grandma died, then we had her for about 5 or 7 years until she passed away. She was very lean, very dark, and her thick, kinky, curly hair was about a half-inch short, and she often used to tell me about how the slaves, which she was one of back in her early teens, kept their hair short and in curls so they could stick hundreds of straight pins into these little ringlets so that the mistresses could not grab them by the top of their heads. Aunt Sal lived until she just was so old she couldn't live anymore. We don't know, but she was somewhere in her 90s. And all I ever remember seeing her eat was soda crackers and lettuce. She did all the washing of the clothes around to my grandmother's, a block and a half away, and then she would come down the middle of 34th Street with a huge basket on her head to deliver our clothes to us. Then she'd sit in a corner back of a hot coal range and nibble on crackers and lettuce. We always wondered what kept her alive. Aunt Sal had 3 sons. One's name was Louis, and he drank a lot. One, Thorny, and Thorny drank a lot. But the oldest one, Will, worked for the Gaslight Company for about 45 years, and he didn't drink. And he provided a good home over in Queens Alley near 31st Street between Wisconsin and Reservoir Street. Now, Louis My dad used to tell me that if he had been a white man, he'd have been one of the greatest pitchers of all time. But they didn't allow him to play baseball. He sold beer and big tubs of lemonade while the baseball games were going on up where the Gordon Junior High School is now, which we used to call the Holler. It was a natural stadium where people sat on the banks around the baseball diamond, and they would let him pitch sometime, just warming up so that the players could get in some batting practice. And my dad said that he could just punch out almost anyone who got up at the bat. He had such speed and courage. Now, he practically raised me as far as pushing me around and hauling me around in baby carriages and little teddy wagons. He took me almost every place he went. And I remember when they used to have card parties, poker parties on Saturday night. Well, he would be the runner. He'd go from our house 5 blocks down the street to Donahue's bar and get a large bucket or growler of beer, and I wasn't allowed inside, and I'd sit on the curbstone until he came out through the swinging doors. And I used to have a little tiny wine glass full of beer, and the poker games were quite big. And I remember one policeman who used to hang his gun and holster up and take his coat off and put on the back of the chair and play poker for an hour or two. Then he'd put his gun and coat on and walk about 50 feet up to the corner box and call in his station and report in and come back in about 5 minutes and sit down and play poker for another hour or two. And now he's the inspector of the police department, Mr. Dick Mansfield. Now, Thorny, the one son who drank quite a bit, he was the first one to die. But Will, the oldest son, who worked for the Gaslight Company and retired with a pension and made such a comfortable home for Aunt Sal, was very fine, and the woman named Red, who was his common-law wife, kept a wonderful, spotless home for them. Once Aunt Sal came down the middle of the street with a large basket of clothes on her head, and she thought it was early morning, dawn, but instead it was dusk. And when she arrived at the house, everybody had a hard time convincing her that it was getting darker and darker instead of lighter and lighter. So we just realized that she'd evidently fallen asleep around at my grandmother's house after doing the laundry in the big wash tub. And instead of being dawn, it was dusk, and we had a hard time getting her to go back home. Another thing I remember very distinctly, and I was very young at that time, was seeing the soldiers bring up Teddy Roosevelt's horse from Fort Myer, and then he would ride up in his buggy with 2 beautiful horses pulling it with his escort, and he would get out of the buggy and step on a big concrete stepping stone and mount his big white horse, and then some of the soldiers would ride with him out New Cut Road, which is now Reservoir Road, and be gone for about an hour and a half or 2 hours, then come back, and the carriage would be there waiting for him. I only remember that as a very, very young little kid. I'll mention about some of the wonderful early times that we had, such as going to Cronia Beach, which was an all-day trip on the steamer St. John's. Dad made pretty good money, and he had 3 meat and poultry markets, and he always carried a lot of money. So he'd always get the largest stateroom on the boat with my uncles and friends, and they'd play poker all the way down on the boat. And Dad always had his hand in his pocket to pay the bills for the drinks and for the stateroom and for dinners, and he was just a sucker for company. And a lady who had the hotel down there, her name was May Golden. Her husband was Billy Golden, a songwriter who wrote a popular song called Turkey in the Hay and Turkey in the Straw. She had a big frame 3-story hotel down there. She was on the watch all the time and had a gravel driveway leading up to this big colonial porch, so not even a buggy and horses could arrive or take off without her looking out of her bedroom window and seeing what was going on, because her room was right on the first floor in the front of the hotel. And on the other side of the lobby was the bar, so she knew everybody who went in and out of the bar, because there was no entrance from the bar into the lobby. You had to go outdoors onto the porch from the bar to get into the lobby, as I recall. We used to take rides in the buggies with the fringe around the top of the buggy, and one Saturday or Sunday, Dad decided to rent the buggy from this man, and I guess the horse didn't like a strange driver holding the reins, but they only got 4 or 5 blocks from the hotel on a straightaway of dusty road when a paper bag or a newspaper blew across the road, and this wild horse took off, and it took about 3 or 4 city blocks before Dad could control it. We were zigzagging from one side of the road to the other and screaming, but he got the horse under control, and we took it on back to the hotel and turned it over to the owner. Another place where we used to enjoy ourselves was over on the Virginia side of the Potomac, up across from Fletchers Boathouse. There was sort of a sandy beach. Of course, you couldn't go bathing because the water was too rough, too many rapids. But there was a nice waterfalls and a lot of big rocks where you could eat your lunch on. And there was a large rope attached to a high limb of a huge tree, and people would swing out over this ravine, over the rocks and the water, to get a good view of the river and all. My sister, this was about 60 years ago, she was about 7 or 8 then, she tried it. She got halfway over the middle of the creek or stream and rocks, and she hollered, "Hey, Mr. Schultz, watch me." And just then her hand slipped and she fell down into the rocks, and we thought she was dead. We thought she'd broken her neck or broken her back or something, so that sort of ruined the picnic for the day. Another big kick we used to get out of getting on the train and going to Chesapeake Beach. That was almost as much of a thrill as getting into a jet plane these days. You'd have to take a streetcar all the way to the Bennings Junction, and then we'd get all excited and didn't even have screens in the windows of the old coaches, and you'd always get cinders in your eye. And we got on the big pier at Chesapeake Beach that extended way out in the water and catch as many crabs as you could carry back. And they'd throw the whole big gunny sack right into a steamer and steam them for you for about 15 or 25 cents. Then everybody would try to smuggle them on the train without the conductor seeing them, and when we get about halfway home, the whole car was scented up with crabs, steamed crabs. But they were the good old days, and I was very young. I'll get on back now to my father. What a hard-working man he was all his life in the meat business, the butcher business, and he was making very good money with 3 meat markets and poultry markets when he was in his late teens, but he gambled it away on horses, and he just loved to play horses, and he did up until the time of his death, about when he was 86. Pop was married to Mama in Philadelphia during the big blizzard of 1888 in Philadelphia, and he used to tell how to get from one person's house to another, you had to tunnel under the snow. You didn't dig trenches, you had to tunnel and walk through like tunnels of snow. It was so deep. When we lived on 34th Street, our backyard ran into the backyard of a firehouse, number 5 truck. Before I get into what happened right there in that neighborhood, we had a wonderful old huckster who sold fruits and vegetables. His name was John the Greek, and the kids were all crazy about him. He'd let them ride on the back step of the wagon while he would lead the horse down half a block at a time. And he would always give the kids the overripe bananas or the overripe apples and the overripe plums. And he was a wonderful character. We had a lot of nice people in our neighborhood right there in Georgetown, near Dent Place and 34th Street. There was one groceryman on one corner, another grocery store on the other corner. And my friend Buster Bell, Ninian Beale, who just retired as a plumber, used to work in this particular grocery store. And the owner did most of the butchering of the meats. And used to be so many flies around in those days. Well, the owner would give us kids piece of licorice stick or hard-boiled ball candy or something for the number of flies we would swat and kill. I remember sometimes some kids would get as high as a cigar box full of flies, and therefore they'd earn a lot of candy. But one Saturday, this old gentleman who owned this grocery store came up the middle of 34th Street with mud up to his neck. We heard that he had jumped in the canal, but the canal was only half full of water, so he didn't drown. They fished him out, and he came home, and people in the neighborhood didn't even know he was a drinking man. So evidently he got all washed up and cleaned up, but then the next day his wife ran out of the store screaming, and a man named Jim Donahue, one of the firemen, ran over and went up in the bathroom, and there he was with his throat cut from ear to ear dead. So Jim Donahue stayed drunk for about 2 weeks trying to get over it. This boy Buster Bell I just mentioned, we used to have a garden down on Haynes Point. The Boy Scouts had gardens. We used to catch these little 3 or 4 inch garter snakes, they call them. I never kept them at home, but Buster had quite a collection of them in cigar boxes with a little piece of screen tacked around the top. And once he took one of them in his pocket to school and curled it up, tail down into a girl's inkwell. When she opened the inkwell, this thing stuck its head out and squirmed around. So he got a good slapping for that, but he was used to it. He'd get slapped 3 and 4 times a week anyway by the teacher, Miss Mary Assar, who was pretty rough, but a wonderful teacher. Well, back to when I was around about 8 years old, I got so acquainted with all these Irish firemen that they gave me the job of walking these 5 beautiful white horses up and down the cobblestone side yard, and I'd whistle to them so they would tinkle. I understood that's what made them tinkle, my whistling. But they'd let me help to clean out the stalls and put in fresh hay and straw, you know. And for one of my birthdays, they gave me a uniform just like theirs. It was green with a white helmet, and on the white helmet, instead of a couple horns at a cross that symbolizes fire department, they had in red letters, Kelly the Chief. So that was my name from then on right up to the present day. Some of the characters or firemen who were all Irish, O'Reilly and O'Donoghue, and all various names like that, would barname the pole on Saturday mornings, so it would be real good and shiny, and I was the one who would go up the back steps and jump on the pole in the bedroom and slide down and hit the big rubber mat. The more I slid down the pole, the more I automatically shined the pole. Then they'd put the ladders up and let me go up a little ways on the ladders. They'd open the big net and let me jump out of just a second-story ledge. Out of the second story went into the net. So when they had just brush fires in the woods, well, they'd never let me stand on the long running board of the truck or the big back step of the pumper or the hose wagon. They'd always tuck me in where they kept the ropes and the hose and brooms and shovels. All I could see was the hoofs of all these 3 big white horses making sparks on the cobblestones. And we'd get out to the woods and they'd cut little pine trees for all the kids and let the kids help beat out the fires that some of the kids had started anyway. So in back of the firehouse there was a big clay hill, and on this clay hill was the benches that Mr. Ward kept his big beehives on. Large boxes about the size of a crate that a dozen cans of tomatoes come in. We used to stand back while he smoked the bees with his smelly smoke with his big mask and big gloves on. He would never give anybody any of the honey. He sold it. And his son, we liked him all right. We'd let him play with us and play Indians and cowboys and all. But this Mr. Ward didn't like children. And we had a boy in the neighborhood, tall, lanky boy. He was about 3 years older than most of us young kids around. He was 10 when we were about 7. And he was paralyzed, his whole right side. And his arm was limp, his leg was limp, and he used a cane. And he was about 6 foot tall with his head on one side, with his tongue half hanging out, and talked tongue-tied, and he was pretty hard to look at. But every time he'd come around the firehouse, Mr. Ward would grab one of the big buggy whips off the apparatus and beat him and chase him away and hit him across the back and legs with this whip. Well, before this Paul, who we call Crazy Paul, ever died or disappeared. And while he was still in the neighborhood, this Mr. Ward had a terrible stroke, and he was paralyzed identically the way Paul was. His whole right side, his right leg, and he used a cane, and except for being a little stouter than Paul, you couldn't hardly tell them apart from the way they walked and acted. These big benches that Mr. Ward used to keep his beehives on, we used to play Indians and cowboys all over those hills and clay banks, and we had a few boys that were pretty bad Indians, and one of them was Bob Chamberlain. He was a pretty tough kid, and he'd have a band around his forehead with a feather and with a wooden knife in his dagger, homemade dagger, in his belt. We'd chase them all around the woods and the hills, and we caught Bob once, and we tied him to one of these benches with his back down and facing up to the sun, and it was a lucky thing we tied him with just ordinary twine or rope, because we had plenty bale wire around that the hay and straw came in for the firehouse horses, but this time we tied him down with cord because we built a fire under him. And of course the fire burned the cord or the rope first, and then he just got on up and walked home. But I realized what would have happened if we had tied him down with wire. He would have been burned really at the stake. In Georgetown, which is hilly, we had a wonderful opportunity to do some wonderful sleigh riding. At 34th and Q Street, there was another big high hill, about 3 stories high, and there was a natural path shaped similar to a bathtub. And when the heavy snows would come, we'd pat that down, and we'd get a fast start down this very steep embankment, cut across the street, and then down this steep Q Street hill. And that was wonderful sledding for just the small sleighs, but a man named Willie Blunden and Irvin Blunden start building these big, what they call trucks. That's 2 sleighs with about a 10 or 12-foot board connected to both of them. About 8 people could ride on it. And we used to ride down the 33rd Street hill on those things all the way to M Street, a distance of about 7 or 8 blocks. And they would really get up terrific speed. So that was our great hobby in the winter, because we had heavy snows and we did an awful lot of sledding then. Sometimes the boys who felt like it would walk way up to Wisconsin and Macomb Street, and then we'd get a long sleigh ride from about 38th Street all the way down to Connecticut Avenue, but you'd only want to do that once a night because it's such a long way back. Then our ice skating was all done on the tidal basin, because that was very smooth ice, and the Army used to furnish 2 or 3 big, huge, like airplane searchlights, and they would just shine it all over the ice at tidal basin. That was wonderful sport. Bill, my son, mentioned that I should talk about how we used to go to the movies for 5 cents on Saturday nights and see Pearl White, and she was usually in a serial where right at the most exciting part they'd cut it off and you'd have to come back the next Saturday night and spend a nickel to see another episode. Or Francis X. Bushman or William S. Hart, and after the Saturday night movie, 2 or 3 of us youngsters would go up to the Connecticut Pie Bakery just a half a block away and go into the counter and ask for a crip. Now, a crip is a pie that's been crippled because it was dropped out of the oven or while handling it, and we used to get these marvelous crip pies for 5 cents hot right out of the oven, and the 2 or 3 or 4 of us would go out and divide it up and sit on the curbstone and eat it with our fingers, whether it was a blueberry or pumpkin or apple or peach pie or whatever they had at the time. And that was a big Saturday night, to have a dime to go to the movies and a nickel to get a crip. On N Street, around the corner from Wisconsin Avenue, where the parking lot is now for the Georgetown Inn, there was an open-air theater all summer. And on Saturday nights, they had what they called the country store night, and that used to draw a big crowd. They'd call out at least 4, 5, or 6 lucky numbers every Saturday night for various prizes. The numbers would be on the stubs of your ticket. But the owner liked my mother very much, and she always won a ham or a basket of groceries or something really worthwhile, and usually she got the first prize. We always ate well, and the best of the meats. Mama would go once a week to the Washington Hotel Supply Company, and Mr. Burrs, the owner, always had nothing but the best cuts of meat for her. The steaks and roast of beefs couldn't be matched anywhere. And where the Georgetown Inn is now used to be called Emmerich's Market, and Mother knew a Mr. Schultz very well in there. And that was one of my big jobs, a couple times a week, carrying all these groceries about 8 blocks up to our home, all uphill. And they had marvelous vegetables and meats in there also. My mother was a very pretty woman all her life, especially when she was young. She worked hard all her life and did a good job managing some lunch stands that my dad got permission to open through the Secretary of the Interior Department. Now, Dad and these few men would build these stands, and they were made so they were portable, like on hinges, so they could be knocked down and then trucked over to another job where another big building would be being built. I'd drive my mother to the market at 10th Pennsylvania Avenue 2 and 3 times a week to load up with all the sausages and cheese and things that she served in sandwiches at these stands. I recall a big piece of pie that she had custom made at this same Connecticut pie bakery. Slice of any kind of pie would only be a dime. These big, delicious hot dogs would be only a nickel. A ham sandwich or a cheese sandwich would only be a dime, and a big mug of coffee would only be a nickel. And I don't remember. I think that a pint of milk was only a nickel too. But even with those cheap prices, Mama made pretty good money out of these little portable stands where she only served lunch to the hard-working men on these big government projects. I don't know how she did it, keeping house and going to markets and running these little lunch rooms, but she managed, and she kept in pretty good health until she got older, and then her bones began to deteriorate, and she couldn't walk for the last 9 years because her bones were like a piece of white chalk. They'd just snap in half if she tried to take a step. I remember years ago, Mrs. Hillary and Mrs. Chamberlain and Mother, we used to go out to what we call the BT Woods, where the big estate is now, which was right across from where Georgetown Hospital is located. The Archibald estate is on the same location now, but every couple of years, a big tribe of gypsies in their wagons and horses, covered wagons, would show up overnight, and they'd have big bonfires around with kettles of soup going, and Mama and Miss Chamberlain and Mrs. Hillary got very well acquainted with these gypsies, especially the king and the queen of the tribe. And I remember that they once said they were going to have this huge wedding, and my mother and her friends make some dresses and blouses, and all of them were good seamstresses, so they felt sorry for the gypsies. They knew they'd be invited to this big wedding. It was supposed to be a big festival. So Mother and all of her friends, after making all these garments, delivered them one day, and the next day when the wedding was supposed to take place, we went up to the woods and everything was cleaned out. The gypsies had left overnight, if I recall correctly. Now, on my father's side of the family, I can only tell you what he told me many a time. Dad's mother lived down near Clinton, Maryland, on the road to La Plata, which goes from La Plata to Leonardtown in southern Maryland. And his mother would leave very, very early in the morning to drive to Washington with her produce, like squash and corn and tomatoes, to sell. So when she got to the 11th Street Bridge at the Navy Yard, she was stopped by soldiers and asked if she'd seen a man on a horseback. And sure enough, she saw this man go by with one leg dangling out of a stirrup. And where she saw him was not far from where Dr. Mudd lived. Now, we never know till this day whether she directed him to Dr. Mudd's home or not, where he set the leg of Wilkes Booth. But it gave him a clue, and they rounded him up in a barn down in Leonardtown, and the way the story goes, a sergeant shot through the wooden cracks in the wall and killed him, and the barn caught fire. They think it was Wilkes Booth that was in the barn, but to this day, some people say he might have escaped across the Potomac River into Virginia and got away and lived a healthy life. I remember one case where when we were down on the bay, where we've been going for the last 60 years, Dad and a group of men, uncles, and a Captain Bazine and a Lieutenant Schultz took a huge old boat that used to be a sailboat and went out fishing. They used big oars to go out into the bay. I remember this distinctly because I had a very bad case of tonsillitis. So they didn't show up for hours and hours, and a big storm came up, and the waves got high, and it was pitch dark, and we were very worried about them. So my mother and Mrs. Harriet Whitehead and myself gathered a lot of driftwood and logs and built a huge bonfire on the beach. And Pop told me that was the only way they could find their way back from this big bonfire burning on the beach, because they knew that we had sense enough to light the way for them. And they did have a lot of fish there. I recall they'd caught a lot of fish, but they got caught in a terrific storm. This Captain Schultz and Bazine lived at our house on 34th Street, but they were connected with chemical warfare, which is now American University, and Dad had built some big concrete vats up there where soldiers would go in and test gas masks with mustard gas. I remember Captain Schultz would come home with fresh burns up each arm of little drops of different acids or gases on his arm. And every Saturday he'd go downtown, this Captain Schultz, and bring Mother a beautiful record by Fritz Kreisler or Al Magluck or Caruso or somebody. He was crazy about records, and Mother loved beautiful music too. This Captain Schultz's father was the originator and inventor, the way I understood it, of the Pyrex glass in Kalamazoo, Michigan years ago. They were wonderful characters. They, I guess, helped to develop many different kind of gases when American University was a gas center for the Army. When Pop was building the foundation for the Lincoln Memorial, the big holes that they poured concrete in were about 25 or 30 feet in diameter and 90 feet deep, and he went down in one to inspect the forms and the wood and the steel before they poured concrete into the footings, they call it. So they started pouring concrete on him, and he was almost buried alive. Some man discovered him when the concrete was about up to his shoulders and just his head was sticking out. And then another time he was hurt pretty bad when a small tractor with no one driving it got loose. The brakes slipped or something and jammed Pop. Warm night, 7 of us got in our big Chandler car, and those days they had sort of collapsible gates that fastened onto the running boards, so all the suitcases were put on the running boards, and it was a 7-passenger Chandler car, touring car, and with the top back we started out for Atlantic City about 5 o'clock in the evening. I remember we got the other side of Baltimore, and about the only road signs in those days were put out by B.F. Goodrich. It'd say 60 miles to Elkton or 50 miles to Aberdeen, and that's about all you could go by. But other side of Baltimore, Dad got lost, and we were heading way down in southern Maryland somewhere. So it took us, I think it was 13 hours to get to Atlantic City. And the whole round trip, I remember sitting on the side of the embankments watching Dad and a fellow named Ralph Randall and my cousin fixing flat tires. And I remember this day we had 13 flat tires to Atlantic City and returned back to Washington, D.C. Well, before Dad was 35, he had lost his 3 meat markets, gambling on the horses, and that's how he went into the concrete business with Fred Drew and Company. They put up the best foundations for all the big, huge Catholic buildings over at Brookland and cathedrals and places like Mayflower Hotel and the Cairo Hotel and Lincoln Memorial. He worked hard. Many times he'd get home at 1 or 2 in the morning and get 4 or 5 hours sleep and then go right back to work on these rush jobs, time limit jobs they'd call them. He used to tell me how on Saturday nights, some Saturday nights, not every Saturday night, He and this Bill Golden, who I mentioned was a songwriter, and John L. Sullivan, the prize fighter, would go to Kernan's Burlesque Theater at Leadenton, Pennsylvania Avenue, and after the theater let out around about 11 o'clock or so, they'd walk to Georgetown, and about every 5 or 6 blocks there would be Negroes with oyster and clam carts with lanterns hanging on them, fresh oysters, and the three of them would stand at one oyster cart until it was empty, and then walk about 6 blocks and empty another cart. Pop said he never saw too many eat so many oysters in his life. And then they'd get up to Joe Slatz's bar, which is now Billy Martin's carriage house, and hang on a few more. And whenever he'd bring Mother a big dozen box of fried oysters with soda crackers, well, we knew he had a little edge on him. But that wasn't too bad. My sister and John Myers, her husband, were very, very good to Mother and Father. They would come all the way from Pittsburgh when he was president of Westinghouse Supply Company. And when they lived in Wynwood and Short Hills, New Jersey, they'd come down every 3 or 4 weeks to spend the weekend. Dad always cooked wonderful roast of beefs or turkeys and hams. And they always came down on Christmas and Thanksgiving to visit Mom and Pop. Pop would really put on a big spread at Thanksgiving and Christmas with turkey and spare ribs and sauerkraut and 2 or 3 kind of potatoes. And he was just a marvelous cook. And by them coming to visit, well, it always gave Mom and Pop a big lift. And then whenever they left, well, they had a little letdown when they departed, but they knew they'd soon be back in 3 or 4 weeks, so everything was all right. In my high school days, I thought I was interested in mechanical drawing and freehand drawing, and I thought I liked working on engines and all. So I went to Tech High School, which was quite a distance from home. I'd have to walk about 5 blocks to the streetcar and go to 7th and F Street, the corner of Heck's department store, and then take another 7th Street streetcar up about 15 blocks to Rhode Island Avenue. But I only stayed there 1 year. Then I transferred to Western High School, which was just around the corner from my house. In my last year, we had a wonderful teacher named Dr. Devitt, and he taught Spanish and English and mathematics. So he opened his own prep school down on 33rd Street between O and P Street. 23 of us left Western High School to go down to help him open this school. It was in 2 private homes that he had bought or rented and had the walls knocked out and had them connected up. But after going there a while, my math was so bad I couldn't get the math like a lot of the boys who finally went to Annapolis and West Point and Coast Guard Academy, and they turned out to be admirals and colonels and generals. But he was a wonderful character, this Dr. Devitt. Only he drank too much. He'd keep a pint of gin right in his desk drawer, even when he taught at Western High School. But everybody loved him. My first girl, if I remember, and the first one I ever danced with, in a little vacant store on the corner of 35th and Reservoir. We called it Baker's Corner. This girl's name was Dorothy Barron. Lived on P Street between 33rd and 34th. And I remember my first dance, and it was to a piece called Dardanella. Well, that was puppy love, but every Sunday I'd go down to her house, and her father was a pharmacist at Hill's Drug Store on M Street, and they were divorced, and Dorothy and myself would go down every Sunday and get a big chocolate nut sundae or banana split or chocolate soda or something on her father, who was a very nice man. She turned out and married finally a fellow named Alvin Albano, who I went to Tech High School with, and he studied architecture and turned out to be a wonderful builder of homes and apartment houses. During the summer months, I remember my first job, I worked in a military tailor shop where they made uniforms next to the Palace Theater on F Street. A man named Weinman, he was a very fine Jewish man, made very expensive uniforms. And my job was to sweep up the scraps of the material. And my worst job was cleaning out a big parrot cage, and he always pecked me. He didn't like me, and he was a dirty old bird. So I only kept that job one summer, and then Other summers, I sold Dodge cars in the summer. I worked in the men's furnishings department of Pally Royal, and then I quit. And next summer, I worked at the mode haberdashery, where I made right good money. And later on, after going to Columbia Tech and Northeastern University, I got a job as a bookkeeper in Potomac Saving Bank, where I made a lot of friends, especially Watson Allenfelt, who has always been a great friend of mine. So after being a bookkeeper for 2 years, a serviceman or mechanic for the Burroughs Ad Machine Company kept after me to try to get a job with the Burroughs Company. And a fellow named Bill Wilson, who was the salesman, told me that if I wanted a job, he would speak up for me and arrange for me to take an examination. And he said, "You'll step into a good job because they don't know it yet, but I'm leaving for Chicago and I'm going to handle the big banks around the loop. And that'll put you into my job, which will be all the big banks in Washington, D.C. So I took the exam and studied right in the office for about a month, and then they put me out on my own selling machines to the banks. I later learned how to install the machines, and I really had the monopoly on the Washington banks.